Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of El Monitor, and this week our guest is Amy Myers Jaffe, managing director of the Climate Policy Lab and a research professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Amy is also the author of Energy's Digital Future, Harnessing Innovation for American Resilience and National Security. And she is a leading expert on global energy policy and sustainability. Amy previously served as the David M. Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and the Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations and Executive Director for Energy and Sustainability at the University of California, Davis, where she led research on low or zero carbon fuels and transportation policy. She is currently co-chair of the steering committee of the Women in Energy Initiative at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Amy is widely published, including as co-author of Oil, Dollars, Debt, and Crises, The Global Curse of Black Gold with Dr. Mahmoud El-Gamal. My conversation with Amy Myers Jaffe about climate and energy trends in the Middle East begins now. Amy, welcome to On the Middle East. It's wonderful to have you join us today to talk about energy and climate trends in the region.
Andrew, wonderful to be here.
Let's start with Glasgow. When we were talking before the show, you observed that prior to Glasgow, Gulf states had been adversarial to climate initiatives. Now they're leaders. And in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have made carbon neutral or carbon zero commitments. Help us understand the context for these efforts. How serious do you see these initiatives by the Gulf? What are both the opportunities and constraints for them to realize their objectives? That is a shift from their reliance on oil and gas.
Well, I think it's a very serious effort. And, it does come across in the context of high oil prices, which may not have been 100% accidental. Of course, high oil prices makes it harder, made it a little bit harder to argue for the Glasgow Accord. You had nations worried about the costs of complying with climate change. But in the end, we had a good agreement and a good meeting at Glasgow. And the Saudis made a commitment to net zero by 2060. UAE had announced its net zero target for 2050. UAE has invested about $40 billion in clean energy, including its nuclear plant, which it calls as clean energy. And they agreed to be the host of one of the next climate meetings 2 years from now. So big commitment there. Saudi Arabia, big push focused on, ammonia/hydrogen exports. The Saudis have invested a lot of time and effort in carbon capture and sequestration. They have greatly reduced the carbon intensity of their oil production. And they have set an ambitious 50% renewables target for 2030. So we're talking about real change. I think that you have, some visionary leadership. And so it's, this whole conflict between short-term, long-term.
Amy, what are the constraints on the Gulf countries in pursuing these initiatives? Because their economies have been so dependent on oil exports. I mean, this is as radical a commitment as one can think about, given how these countries economically have been organized.
Well, there's a thesis which I find somewhat correct, which is that we're not going to disappear oil use, in the next 10 or 20 years. We're just going to really reduce it. And so when you look at a Saudi Arabia or UAE or Kuwait, these are countries with a very low cost production base. And at least in the case of Saudi Arabia, they've made a fantastic strides in making sure that their production, their own production, does not have excess methane leakage and other kinds of environmental problems. And so I do think that the transition, is going to allow for some extent of retaining market for oil on top of this pivot, which they are very well placed to do. I mean, we're talking about a region that has ample solar energy. We're talking about a region that is used to exporting ammonia, producing hydrogen. So they're really well positioned to both take a place in the new energy order and also to sort of straggle along and maintain their position in the old energy order, for some period of time.
Egypt is hosting COP27. That's the Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Change Conference this year. And Cairo has the attention of U.S. climate envoy John Kerry and others for the steps it is taking. Explain for us the COP27 initiatives and how Egypt and the region fit into the international climate agenda.
Well, it's very important and interesting to have the next meeting in Egypt because, of course, that gives the opportunity to pull in Africa, to pull in the Middle East, and really get, commitments front and center. Egypt is a member of something called the Adaptation Action Coalition that involves the UK and some other European countries, but also developing world countries. And the idea, I think, is to make sure there's a balance between helping the global South with the immediate impacts of climate change and providing finance and blended finance to cope with climate change, in addition to sort of bringing along countries to raise their ambition for what they can do in mitigation. And again, Egypt has an ambitious renewable energy target. They're currently at 20% renewable energy. They are targeting to get to 42% by 2030. So, there's just a lot of momentum and pressure. And indeed, you've got parties like Italy saying, hey, listen, we're going to be the transit hub for green hydrogen and green electricity into Europe. And so you can kind of see the outlines of sort of a new geopolitics of clean energy moving forward while we're still in the thick of our old geopolitics of oil and gas.
You've written a fair bit on the geopolitics of hydrogen. You mentioned that earlier. Tell us about this trend and what it means for the Middle East.
Well, it's hydrogen's anybody's game. A lot of countries are gearing up. It looks very similar to what we know in other energy spheres. You've got Japan doing hydrogen buyer diplomacy. As I mentioned, you've got Italy talking about how it could be a important transit hub. And you've got Saudi Arabia, sort of throwing down the gauntlet that it wants to be a major exporter. But then you have a lot of other players. You've got Gazprom. Prior to this hullabaloo about Nord Stream 2 and the border of Ukraine, Gazprom was really moving forward on hydrogen and indeed had proposed that it would build hydrogen processing plants to be at the end of Nord Stream 2. So putting plants in Germany to use blue gas. So we're going to take, maybe add some CCS. Russia even has talked about being able to provide hydrogen to Europe from nuclear power. But now, of course, that's called into question as Europe steps back and says, is Russia a reliable supplier? And then you have the sort of incoming of offshore wind in Denmark. You've got Shell talking about being a big player in offshore wind to green hydrogen. You've got the US talking about its 4 hydrogen hubs, which could involve exports. You've got Australia talking about being a hydrogen export. So that really is going to raise this geopolitical question, which is as the cost of what we call electrolyzers, so the equipment it takes to take renewable energy and make hydrogen by splitting water. The question is, will countries want to produce their own green hydrogen? Or will we start to see sort of a hydrogen trade, via ship? Will it look like LNG? Will countries do a mix of domestic versus imported? So a lot of questions remain, and it's anybody's guess who's going to win the space. But I think the Middle East countries have made it clear that they'd like to be a major player in this space.
Amy, the Emir of Qatar was in Washington last week, and one of the agenda items for the Biden administration was whether Qatar could help mitigate a potential loss of Russian gas supplies in the event of an escalation over Ukraine. Does Qatar have that capacity, and what are the prospects for the LNG markets in the Middle East?
Well, of course, Qatar's made it clear that it doesn't have excess capacity, but of course, there's always the possibility, which we saw during the Fukushima accident. There's always the possibility that a producer can work with its customers, or customers can come to a producer and do a temporary shift of cargoes, right? Redirect cargoes. So I'm sure the Biden administration, of course, would like Qatar to show flexibility if a Japan or a Brazil or South Korea or other countries are willing to defer or redirect their LNG to Europe in the case of a further emergency. So I think we're not talking about shifting it right now. You've got a tremendous amount of US LNG, headed for Europe in January. I think what's on the agenda is, if hopefully doesn't happen, Russia were to invade the Ukraine and there would be some kind of disruption. I think that the Biden administration is working with buyers and sellers to see how much optimally could be redirected to Europe. And in the meantime, it's kind of to Qatar's advantage, because they have the expansion coming of North Field LNG. It's going to be up 40% to 110 million tons a year. It's currently 77 million. And that's going to start in, 2025, 2026. So the question is, will Qatar be able to take this opportunity now and get people into long-term contracts for this increase that's coming in several years? And, it's the big question, with the Europeans say to themselves, listen, we've got to make plans. We have to diversify over time. We're going to take a term contract with Qatar or not. And I think, that's kind of where we stand today. So there's both the question of how flexible can I be in terms of redirecting cargoes in an emergency. And then there's the next layer, which is, as we move to the next generation of LNG, who's out there, who's willing to sign long-term contracts, and will people pay a premium to have a long-term contract because, relying on the spot market looked a little unattractive in February.
We haven't even gotten into OPEC and the oil markets and prices. What do you see happening this year, factoring in a possible Iran nuclear deal, which would mean a boost in Iranian exports, adding to global supply, and possible sanctions on Russia if the situation in Ukraine escalates, and if that would have an impact on the global oil market?
Well, Andrew, as you're pointing out, there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And I like to contextualize it. I call this the COVID supercycle. So as you know, I've written a book together with my colleague from Rice, Mahmoud Al-Gamal, and our big point is that there's this sort of cycle to oil and gas that is sort of a boom and bust that's tied to not only the secular global economic cycle, but to geopolitical cycles. And what I would say happened, and the way we have to think about this, we used to, in the old days, of course, the cycle was like decadal. And then suddenly we got to the point where every couple of years we were in a cycle, because the shale can cycle, up and down so quickly. But now, because of COVID, we saw like the cycle on steroids. So we had this complete and total collapse of demand and unprecedented level to unprecedented shrinkage in 2020. And countries, in the spring, we forget. I mean, countries ran out of storage tanks. They had to literally turn off production because there was no place to put the oil. countries stopped drilling, companies stopped drilling. So now turn around and we get the V-shaped recovery. Was not quite as much as a V as we'd hope, but United States was roaring at 6% growth in GDP. We haven't seen that in a long time. So all of that, and you had some extra oil use in the vehicle sector. In certain cities, people using a vehicle instead of taking mass transit. But the bottom line is oil demand gained suddenly in 2021 and brought prices with it toward the end of the year. There's like this momentum. And of course, the market started to focus on whether OPEC had enough spare capacity, and the market started to get very overheated. But, the story could end the way it always ends when OPEC overheats the market. And that is, we have a high risk between inflation and debt burdens of the low-income countries. You've got, some kind of economic problems in China related to supply chains and electricity disruptions. So we could see this robust global growth that people are predicting to be 4% this year, 2022. We could see that dematerialize, partly because of the high oil prices, but that we're going to see rising production. You've got in the US, they're drilling the shale again. We're going to be able to see that volume in the second half of the year. You've got rising production from Canada, Guyana, Brazil. And, Citibank estimates, if you add it all up, they have some giant number, like 7 million barrels a day, which seems impossible to me that it could be that high, but that's where their numbers fall. And whatever the case, we know there's production coming on from non-OPEC. And so it's really about what happens between now and when that oil starts to trickle into the market, right? Do we see a geopolitical events? Do we see switches in sanctions policy in either direction? And, I think it's, even for an experienced old pro like yourself and myself, it's pretty hard to call because there's so many variables at play. But if we had stable geopolitics, which is a very big if in today's world, you could see the oil price come back down as this new production from non-OPEC, makes itself felt as we get to the spring.
And what about the impact of the possible Iranian oil coming back on the market in the event of an Iran nuclear deal?
Well, we've had many times that the market has moved on the basis of predicting a Iranian nuclear deal. And there was like a little uptick in optimism, I guess what it was 2-3 days ago. Russia certainly putting out the story that it is brokering a major international agreement showing how it's global leadership, but given how many troops it has on the border of the Ukraine, it seems a little inconsistent. Anyway, point is, it again depends on the circumstances in the Ukraine and elsewhere. So if we have a return to stability via diplomacy, and that were to be able to build towards a deal with Iran, then I think we could see, some cooling off of the oil market. But I think, part of the challenge I see is that the politics of an Iran deal with the United States are always dicey on either side, either in Tehran or in Washington. We're coming to the midterm elections this fall. And so it's not like making a deal with Iran is a popular issue for Americans. It's sort of off the radar screen. And what happens between the United States and NATO and Europe and Russia is high priority, front and center, is taking up a lot of attention. And so I think it's very hard to foresee, how all those pieces are going to fall into place. You're going to have a solid negotiation in Europe. You're going to have Russia playing a constructive role internationally, both in resolving its troop movements around the Ukraine and brokering, being an honest broker in the United States negotiation with Europe and Iran and the parties. There's a lot to fall into place to make that happen. And I do not believe that that risk of Iranian oil coming back to market is in the price of oil today. If we start to see things move in the right direction, then I think you would see the markets would cool off.
What role does China play in global energy markets, and how does it impact the Middle East?
Well, listen, there's no question that when the Chinese had their disruption to domestic electricity, they ran out to buy some LNG, and that is what got the natural gas prices, moving everywhere because they're such a big buyer. And there's just this sense that, that China sneezing in the oil market or in the gas market, it's just reverberates. But, Beijing always has it on their mind how to be more self-sufficient. It doesn't like being dependent on seaborne movements, whether that's oil or gas. It's made no real moves, truly, to speak of in a substantial way to be, active in providing and defending the security of Middle East countries. Honestly, it hasn't even really been that proactive leading in diplomacy involving the Middle East. I mean, it plays, sometimes it plays a constructive role, but ultimately it's not been replacing the United States in diplomacy. It's not been effecting strong diplomacy in the Middle East. So when we talk about, development finance, China's played a big role, especially in Africa. When we talk about trade, China's very important. But you don't really see anybody stepping up and talking about how China is going to be the guarantor of national and sovereign borders. You don't see discussion of China being at the lead in making sure that the sea lanes are free for international trade. And so I think at this point, when we talk about China, their global role is as an economy, and in some regional matters where they've really asserted themselves, obviously strongly positioned in new energy, strongly positioned in nuclear plant sales, though not so much as the Russians. But in the big mix picture, in the picture of the whole global picture, China has not really taken this very global mantle when it comes to security. And I think that that is a big difference, despite how important and futuristic it is for countries to look at China as a market. A lot of people say that, oil and gas demand in China is itself going to peak because they're making such a big push to clean tech, and they've made these commitments. So I think the jury is still out whether or not their sort of very impactful footprint in the spot market and in pricing will continue or ease over time.
Amy, last question. How do you see the trend in nuclear energy, both globally and in the Middle East?
Well, I think nuclear is playing an important role in the Middle East. China has certainly made a bet on nuclear power for inside China. And, even the United States, which really had looked like it was moving away from nuclear, you're seeing some more seriousness. We're actually seeing startups in the United States for small advanced reactors. So I I know it's a controversial, shouldn't we classify nuclear as clean energy? But I do believe, especially in the developing world, that you have a lot of leaders that look favorably on nuclear. And so I do think it's going to be part of the mix going forward.
Amy, this has been great. I always learned so much from you. I've been a huge fan and consumer of your work. Thank you for joining us today on the Middle East.
Thanks for having me.
We will return after this short break.
I'm Elizabeth Hagedorn, and I'm the State Department correspondent at Al Monitor.
And I'm Joe Snell. I'm Al Monitor's video editor. Let's admit it, this past year has been difficult to stay on top of the news and sift through what's accurate and what's misleading. Let Al Monitor help you.
If you care about the Middle East and North Africa, you should consider listening to Al Monitor's audio series On the Middle East with Andrew Parasalidi and Amber Zaman, and On Israel with Ben Caspi. You can now watch our newest video podcast, Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. You can subscribe to these series on your favorite podcast platforms.
And through a host of free daily and weekly newsletters, we offer a range of perspectives with the highest journalistic standards. You can subscribe to these newsletters at almonitor.com.
As an award-winning media service headquartered in Washington, D.C., Al Monitor has a network of over 160 contributors around the world.
So if you haven't done so already, be sure to visit almonitor.com, where you can find all of these newsletters and podcasts along with first-class reporting and analysis.
Thanks to our guest, Amy Myers Jaffe, and our production team of Beowulf Rockland and Rosabelle Hine of Two Squared Media Productions. We will be back next week, and if you haven't done so, please sign up for all three of our podcasts at your favorite podcast platform. Reading the Middle East with Gilles Capel. His guest this month is His Royal Highness Prince Turki Al Faisal Al Saud, who discusses his new book, The Afghanistan File. And next week, Gilles will be interviewing Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa. On Israel with Ben Caspit, and Ben's guest this week is former Israeli Minister Ephraim Sneh. And of course, this podcast on the Middle East, where my guest next week will be Dr. Volker Perthes, the special representative of the UN Secretary General for Sudan. Thank you all for listening, and please keep up with all of the news and trends in the Middle East at almonitor.com.